All right, our third section of our last unit is Kennedy, Johnson, and actually a little bit with the Warren Court. For both Kennedy and Johnson, we actually have covered a lot of the things that we had with our civil rights and then Vietnam. Now we're going to look at more the political side of things that we look at. For your EOC, there's a lot of broad things on here. This is where I know that a lot of the things that are probably the most interesting with Kennedy, you probably wouldn't have a question. I spent a lot more time on that in class, even though you're not going to. But things especially involving like the Cuban Missile Crisis and foreign affairs are definitely questions that could be asked along this side. For Johnson, we covered with the civil rights, which will be covered before, and the Vietnam side for Johnson. The overriding thing that you'll see here will be with the war on poverty that he has. In this case, a little bit goes back earlier, but most of this is the 63 and the 68 for our bracketing dates. All right, Kennedy becomes president in 1961. Before that, we have the election of 1960. We have John F. Kennedy running against then the current Vice President Richard Nixon. They're actually very close in age, but most everybody thinks that Kennedy is a lot younger. Part of the reason was looks. Kennedy is a very good-looking man, seemed more youthful. Nixon also may not be the prettiest man that there is, but he'd also been around for a long time. If you think about it, is our anti-communists and the House on Un-American Activities committee involved in was right after World War II. He has then been vice president for 8 years. So he's pretty much been right in the middle of the thick of national politics for 15 years. Kennedy, in the first televised debate, I spent a long time on this in class, kind of going over different debate techniques, but for a long story short for this, Nixon had decided that for his campaign he was going to visit all the states. He then had to have knee surgery. He still tried to do it. He really was wearing himself out. A couple days before the debate, he hit his knee that he had the surgery on, caused an infection. He just looked sick as can be. Then he's sweating at the time. You even see the picture that I have. He's stiff, and Kennedy looks all nice and relaxed there. When people were interviewed afterwards that listened to it on the radio who won the debate, Nixon won the debate according to people that listened to it. But this was our first televised debate, and people that watched it had by a large margin said that Kennedy had won. And this will be the closest election that we will have in 75 years, and the closest that we'll have until the 2000 election. Yes, it was closer than even 2016 or 2020 because those electorally were not that close. It was said that if one person in every precinct had switched a vote, then Nixon would have been president. It was that close in so many different places for electoral college. So Kennedy becomes president, and things do not start out good for him. There has been a plan that has been in the works ever since the Cuban Revolution, and where a lot of the Cuban expatriates were down in South Florida. They were planning to try to go, and the U.S. military is going to help them reinvade their country. The plan was from the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy takes on. I kind of go over what the psychology I did for groupthink, and this is a lot of times used for an example in social psychology, where most everybody saw parts they didn't like, but nobody would actually speak up about this. And this was a flaw that was seen afterwards. Kennedy will redo it. There are a lot of things that go wrong, and by all kinds of different groups. I mean, the CIA, the Air Force, Navy, there's all these problems. The Cuban refugees, they were training down in the University of Miami, but they were not given as much training. The hope that the people would uprise and join with them, that doesn't happen. It is a major, major catastrophe. There you see the one political cartoon, which normally it says Cuban fiasco, but you see the Cuban cigar blowing up in Kennedy's face. And this is where it is seen just like as absolutely horrible for it. But what ends up happening for this is Kennedy comes back and says, it's my fault. He's the one to blame for it. He did not go and blame it on people in the CIA or military leaders that screwed up. Now, if you paid attention in the next couple of months and you saw this person was demoted, this person retired early, you could figure out who messed up. on this. But Kennedy said that this is where he was the one at the fault. And I kind of got in class and said, I haven't seen that. I mean, our current president blames it on the last president. Our last president blamed it on the president before, and so on. I mean, we really have had this. We have not had someone say, like for Kennedy, this is my fault. I mean, kind of in the way that Truman was with the buck stops here. So again, he takes the blame for it. One of the long-term effects we'll have as Kennedy realizes after the Bay of Pigs and the beginning of some of the things for Vietnam, again, we're sending advisors, but he's realizing that the Eisenhower style of massive retaliation is not for what the military needs to be. So we end up having flexible response, and we redesign the military. It takes over a decade before a lot of this takes fully in effect there. But the military that we have today, with all kinds of different special units and special forces to do things, was what Kennedy came up with. So when you think of like the SEAL team and the Marine Recon groups and the Green Berets, that's where there was more of that was done in here. And again, our military today is set up there. This is only one line in the notes, but this is something that's kind of seen as part of the ideas that Kennedy will have. His most famous line in his inaugural address is, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And the Peace Corps was one that was established, and we will have people that act basically like missionaries, just not for a religious reason. And Kennedy had told the baby boomers, you are the most fortunate generation in the history of the world, and to get back, and they did there, and they will go and spend, instead of graduating from college, I gotta get the newest car, they would go and maybe spend 2 or 3 years, and are representing America. And it was kind of that idea that we have, and Kennedy had a lot of idealism there. We went over Berlin Wall before there, when I had the Berlin airlift, but this is where the Berlin Wall crisis, when it hits, where overnight they put up a fence which over the next few years becomes the wall that becomes a symbol of communist Europe. And when this is happening, Kennedy will go and take a
Heather Bishop Memorial T-shirt.
Take a trip right in the middle of the hardest. He doesn't avoid it. He doesn't go and just give a speech from the White House. He actually flies right into West Berlin and gives the Ich ein Berliner speech. Yeah, I know he's kind of joked about it as the "I am a jelly donut" there, where he mispronounced some words, but I am definitely not a person that's going to make fun of anybody mispronouncing words in here. But that is where we will have this wall that then will go up. That will be there until 1989. We also had the space race before, where I went on about with Sputnik, but it was JFK that really truly does make it for the moon. Now, the space race, we are not actually, our number one goal is actually not so much for the moon. This is where JFK knows that if you are telling people we need to develop the technology to have intercontinental ballistic missiles so we can blow up anything in the world, not as many people are for that. But when you tell them and give them a goal for this and that same technology to put a person on the moon and bring them back. And the one thing about this is a lot of times governments have plans and presidents have plans, but they usually don't follow through with them, much less do it in this time. And where he says by the end of the decade we'll put a man on the moon, we do. I mean, we barely get there in 1969, but we get there. And this is where you think of Cape Canaveral, where NASA in Florida is, and Mission Control in Houston. And in 1969, Neil Armstrong will be the first man to step on the moon here. Now, for Florida and Houston, some people wonder, why do we have this separated? And later on, we'll have the space shuttle. They'll land in California. You have to think Cold War. You don't want to put everything in one location. So you want to spread out different locations so that if there are any sort of military strikes there. All right, probably the biggest event that you definitely need to know about, but in the Cold War even, will be the Cuban Missile Crisis. As we have U-2 spy planes that are flying over Cuba, we then see, first of all, we see that there are things for missiles that are being made. And pretty much the Soviets are there. How do we know the Soviets are there with it? Well, we see soccer goals. The Cubans love baseball, and suddenly the military camps had soccer goals, and that gave away the fact that the Russians or the Soviets are helping them out. Now, the military, those missiles did not have the operating systems. They were on their way, and what will end up happen will be these 13 days there, and basically where some people say like 13 of the most dangerous days in the history of the world, because we were almost on World War III, and if for World War III, if one side started, the other side, we would have mutual assured destruction. So what ended up happening during this time is the military leaders on both sides were wanting to attack. They were encouraging Kennedy to make an invasion on Cuba. The military leaders and the Soviet Union were also encouraging this. Kennedy announces a quarantine. Now, a quarantine is a blockade. It's semantics. Okay, he's calling it a quarantine, but we were blockading. And we will come very close. The Soviets will actually even fire some over our ships, not hit our ships. They were trying to draw our fire and have us hit them first. But what ends up happening is by some backroom negotiations that we have, we end up coming to a solution. The United States will not invade Cuba. The Soviet Union will remove the missiles there, and then the United States will remove missiles that were in Turkey at that time, right on the border of the Soviet Union. Historically, this is where it's being seen there that Khrushchev blinked there. Now, this is one for the EOC. You notice the political cartoon. This is a famous political cartoon that's been used. You have maps of things there, newspapers, the pictures. Be used to the pictures that you have of this. So this has been a repeat AP or EOC question. Why are we doing this? What's so important about this? Well, first strike capability. You see that pretty much if they do have missiles in Cuba, they can hit most anywhere in the continental United States. Again, the different pictures that you see, look at the date, 1962. If you see something like a satellite picture, it's probably about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You see this cartoon where you have Kennedy and Khrushchev where they're trying to close the box, and inside the box is this monster of nuclear war. And the biggest significance that you have for the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is actually the closest that we ever come to World War III, which would be a nuclear war. The impact on Florida. Okay, the space race was major for Florida. If you go to the area, I mean, Merritt Island went from being a place that hardly anybody was living into, that thousands of people were moved to in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There, with the impact of NASA on the east coast of Florida. The Bay of Pigs, where they did the training down at the University of Miami. A lot of the Cuban refugees were down in the Miami area and other parts of Florida. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, a huge impact. A lot of those sorties are flying from MacDill and from Patrick Air Force Base and Key West Naval Air Station. And so we have this. I mean, once again, the war is major for Florida. Here's where we're thinking might do an invasion, as we are starting to bring supplies down into South Florida for this. The effect of the Cuban Missile Crisis that a lot of times don't think of as much today, but where you see the legendary red phone. Because Khrushchev and Kennedy could not directly talk to each other, we will establish a direct line between the Kremlin in Moscow and the White House in Washington, D.C. So before we decide to make a nuclear war and start World War III, we do have a chance for our leaders to talk to each other. Another thing that was signed there will be the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Here, we're not going to test the atmosphere. Later on, this is expanded. We will also have talks for reducing arms, which later on our future presidents, especially Nixon and Carter, will continue on with this there. But what ends up happening is on the other side of this was the space race to try to get for ICBMs there, where you didn't have to worry about location. There, we could have a missile in the middle of South Dakota and launch it and go anywhere that we want. This is actually, Mr. Betts does a pretty entertaining but a good summary of things for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, for Kennedy's domestic plan there, he had a lot of really good ideas. They were called the New Frontier. And what's the New Frontier? Well, it's basically the Fair Deal rewritten, which was expansion upon the New Deal. He's calling for things for the inner cities. He's calling for a lot of civil rights. He's calling for aid for education. If you remember the civil rights section of notes that we had, that Congress didn't pass it, and very little that he had actually got passed by Congress. So one of the highlights that we have, though, is for the civil rights laws that were already there, we will have it, his brother, who was Attorney General, will be one that will prosecute here. This is why Not only is Forrest Gump at the doorstep speech there with it, but truly Robert Kennedy is there to make sure that, as George Wallace says, segregation now, segregation forever, and then steps away, but make sure it is. Our Attorney General is our top cop in America there. So you're in charge of the FBI, the CIA, or not the CIA, but the DEA and other parts of that bureaucracy. So that's where you see the impact. That's one thing that Kennedy did too. The Housing Act of 1961 was passed. It did do some things, but not as much as we're going to see under Johnson here. One thing that a lot of people do not realize, where we see trickle-down economics, when a recession was occurring, Kennedy will push for trickle-down or supply-side economics. Normally you think of that for a Republican, but in this case it is a Democrat. There have been times in history that has worked, such as Reagan, in this case with Kennedy, and there are times like the 1920s that it didn't work here. The key thing about it is, even though very little of his domestic plan went through, much of it did with Johnson's Great Society. I had told in the Civil Rights about how Johnson will use the president's death to help pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, when you do your interviews, you're going to see that we're going to have a large number of people with that question of who was the greatest leader that you remember. A lot of people will be JFK. If it's normal, that'll probably be the number one person that is picked. And why? Because did he really accomplish very much in the fabled 1,000 days or 2.5 years? And a lot of this is image. You see, I mean, that picture in the middle, it's a young family there, and this is the idea of Camelot. Remember the Knights of the Round Table, Sir Arthur's court. But this is where the idea for idealistic and youthfulness, and then Jackie. I mean, this is where Kennedy was seen as a good-looking guy, but Jackie, and I'll have some pictures here where it's not what you normally think of for a first lady there. And there's so many things about Kennedy that you look at that even though you may not have concrete evidence, but why a lot of people will believe this. Even when you see his quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," and this beginning of the Peace Corps that he has, and even for probably the most negative thing in his campaign, in his short time as presidency, the Bay of Pigs, that actually is seen as good leadership, because even though it was a major flaw there, he took responsibility and got the respect for people. Him using trickle-down economics, something that's normally seen as Republican there, and he was going for some different party. The Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the biggest concrete things have, but even there you can kind of point to some things that was he actually a little bit soft on communism, and that's for his detractors. The space race, yeah, he gives a speech, but he gives goals. We actually accomplish it. So when you look back in there, and even though the New Frontier programs weren't passed, his fight for it will be something that will be done with this. Now, here's where, and I know when we're going to watch one of the videos, one of the statements that was made was that probably one of the greatest Cold War warriors was Kennedy, in the fact that just his looks and Jackie's looks, and you compare it, and on the world stage. And later on, we get to the 1980s, and where one of our thesis ideas is that what won the Cold War, ultimately, some of it, one of the thesis ideas you can say is, well, it's Pepsi and Levi jeans. But here's where the American culture, and you just compare the pictures. All right, communism on paper, everyone's supposed to be equal. Well, if we're communists, then you all wear equal uniforms here to school, and it gets more drab. But Jackie and John F. Kennedy, they were seen with the glamour, and you see a picture of it. This is our first lady that you have, and just kind of, I mean, women at that time, I mean, this is where they wanted to be like Jackie Kennedy, who was just, again, seen as elegant and glamorous, but still young. Again, they have young children in the White House. All right, in November 1963, JFK will fly to Texas. He will first go to the Johnson Space Center, and he will give a speech there. The next day, he will come to Dallas, and this is when he's assassinated. Now, later on, we're going to kind of go in and play with some of the conspiracy theories there. They're fun to look at. All right, don't go down the rabbit hole. Okay, and this is where there's a lot of these different conspiracy theories, and I'll show a part from the trial scene in the movie JFK, but then I'll also show you a part there, where if we use modern CSI evidence, where in that scene you're like, oh my God, the magic bullet, but then when you do CSI side of it, oh, maybe it's not quite that way. A lot of what we have is where Zapruder, when you see the name Zapruder, he had a hand film, so we have some things on that happened. The Warren Commission will investigate. They will have over 20 books that are written with all kinds of people that they interviewed over time, and there's a lot of things in there that are conflicting that you have. And some people in the beginning believed in conspiracy, but it's grown more over time in here. And why do we have this? Well, first of all, JFK's the person that they say killed him was Lee Harvey Oswald. 3 days after he was killed, you see his picture. Jack Ruby will go and shoot him at point blank range. So we can't talk to him. And a lot of people, it's hard for them to think, can it just be one crazy man that takes down the president? It's got to be something bigger than that. So this is where we have a lot of conspiracy theories, like different groups, whether it be the KKK, which would wanted to take Kennedy down for his fight for civil rights, or the Mafia, where there were some of the things that he was having Robert Kennedy do it. And both of those groups, one of the biggest things to kind of show that it probably was not those is over the next couple of decades, as many people that was arrested, there would have been someone, if you have something organized, that's going to kind of spill the beans a little bit, and that never happened. There's conspiracy theories that it was Castro with Cuba, and Castro probably gave the best answer to that. He said the United States was trying to find a reason to invade. Why would he do it? Because if he killed the president of the United States, that gave him a perfect reason to invade there. But one of the biggest ones, and this is where the movie JFK comes, is that it was part of our own government. Today we call it the deep state, but part of the military. And the movie JFK there makes allegations there that it was the military itself because they wanted to expand in Vietnam, and they were afraid that JFK was actually going to instead of expand, would go in here. So again, a lot more people today believe at that time, and it's grown over the years. The movie JFK helped with a lot of that, but just try to remember that what's real history and the conspiracy. They're fun to kind of look at, but just because someone believes it there. All right, our next president is Johnson. Most of what we had for Johnson was what we had in the civil rights and then for Vietnam. But the part of his domestic plan that you need to look at here is the Great Society programs. After JFK is assassinated, Johnson's going to become president. He was a former congressman. That is why he's able to push through a lot of those bills for the civil rights. Now, one thing that really affects the Great Society programs will be the book that we had earlier in the 50s. Michael Harrington writes The Other America. It's kind of like your old-fashioned muckraker, but talking about how even though the suburbs had been really nice, people are being left behind in the rural areas and in the inner cities. So when you see for the Great Society in here, the generalized thing that you need to know is war on poverty here. In the past, I went a lot more in depth on it. I've kind of learned over the years that you don't have to know as many of these different programs, but there are certain programs that you need to know in broad part. Two programs you do have to know by name are Medicare and Medicaid. Because health insurance is one of the most expensive thing. Medicare for people 65 and older, Medicaid for people disabled and poor there. And this is where we kind of take with Medicare the idea of Social Security and do it for health insurance, but we're also on the war on poverty. A lot of money will be given to poor schools and poor school districts. We will have the Immigration Act. That is part of it. It will end quotas. It will set up a different type of immigration system that we're going to have till 1986 until we change it. One thing that you will see, and this is where we can kind of say from modern politics, a lot of the direction of the Republicans and Democrats, you can kind of say starts in 1964 with what things they're fighting for. A great example will be where the Democrats are more likely to push for money for the arts and humanities, where Republicans are more likely to cut that out. A lot of things that Republicans and Democrats disagree on how it should be done. This is where a lot of this starts. Money for universities and housing system. Even when you think of where the term defund the police. Well, part of the idea for the Great Society was more money go for alternative things, not always for just pursuing the crime in there, which which part of defund the police is that idea that police officers aren't always to handle like mental issues in there. The war on poverty is going to be the idea of the economic Office of Economic Opportunity. Created a lot of different programs. I'll talk in class about the Head Start program, but again, that war on poverty, you think Great Society in there. Both positive and negative, depending on you look at it, as problems came up, we will develop more bureaucracies in there. So as we have the Interstate Highways Department of Transportation, as we have the inner cities being focused on, we'll have the Housing and Urban Development Department that is established. Trivial, but something you do need to know here is Albert Weaver will be our first African American cabinet member. Notice this is like more than 3 decades after the first woman with Frances Perkins here. But the reason why I say it's both positive and negative is they are focusing on problems, but this is the more and more government and more national government that you have here. 2 books that you need to know. One we had earlier was Silent Spring, but this is where Johnson will start it, but we'll actually see more of the bills passed during the next president with Nixon on some of the effects after Rachel Carson wrote about the pesticides there. Unsafe at Any Speed. We did not have this earlier. Ralph Nader will write a book there about some of the Chevrolet cars that were unsafe and what GM was doing to hide it. GM will try to blackmail him. He'll sue GM. He will win a large amount of money. What does he do with this money? He starts a consumer advocacy program. And this is why for generations after that, Ralph Nader was very much celebrated. I mean, he'll be running for third parties for president from the Green Party, and I believe 2016 was the Reform Party. So this is one that he had because he was kind of seen as someone that was fighting for the common man when usually it was more corporations. Part for Civil Rights, again, a reminder where we have probably the 3 biggest civil rights bill with the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, and the 68 Civil Rights Act. These were pushed through by Johnson in here. And if we look at him on the domestic side of it, there he is seen as like probably our top civil rights president, and domestically framed for the war on poverty, seen as one of our greatest domestic policy presidents. But what always ends up happening is you have the Vietnam side of it. And this is where we kind of look at the legacy of it in here. Now, did he accomplish many goals on poverty? Yeah, there. Did we eliminate poverty? Not at all. Can we? No, we can't. Was it a success? Even though I used to work for the Republican Party, and there's the next slide I have is something that you can't deny in there, because there were successful parts of it here. We will cut the level of people living in poverty in half in less than 10 years. There's nothing that we can kind of see in government that's been that successful in such a short time that we have in there. So you have to say that yes, it was a success in the war on poverty. No, we didn't get rid of it. And when you see this graph, you will see that some of those things that were then removed later on in the 80s and the effects of that time period. Now the positives and negatives, here's where you can kind of look at things and see whether it be the stereotypes of this, but some of the effects when you look at welfare programs today. There are safety net programs and where they're needed. I mean, we saw that with the pandemic with Florida, where we had probably the absolute worst unemployment system in the United States, and the problems that came when it was needed as a safety net, and then it wasn't there in it. So having these programs that were developed, and the positive side of this, and getting people out of poverty and giving people a chance to step up there. So they served a purpose there. But what are the negatives? And this is where you look at, are there people that will take advantage of it or work the system and have fraud there? So when you kind of think of welfare, both the positives and negative welfares, that's where you kind of look at the Great Society programs that you would have. Now the other 2 questions on here, the answer for both is Vietnam. Okay? Focus would go off the program of the Great Society because of Vietnam. There. In economics, you're going to have a term, guns or butter. What is the government going to focus on? Is it going to be guns or is it going to be butter? And there, that means military or social. Military is very expensive. Vietnam got very expensive. The Great Society programs were very expensive. We as a nation could not afford to do both. And when the focus was more and more on Vietnam later in the decade, that's where the Great Society programs would be cut back in there. Why did LBJ decide not to seek re-election in '68? Vietnam. Again, his popularity was so low. What he was doing domestically didn't matter. There's some people kind of look, and we see our next president. If you take away Watergate and you kind of look at for Nixon, and where he was seen as a strong foreign policy president. Some people say if we were to make a president, put Johnson's domestic side with Nixon's foreign policy there. But both of them that you have, and this is where a lot of the things you kind of look again, the partisan, once you start 1964 there. But step back, look at it and for the eyes of history, okay, not on policy side. All right, this was the chart that I told you. If you look at that, where we go, we cut. You see here, it's about 23%, gets down to about 11% here. When you see these darker areas on a graph like this, that means that there's a recession. Notice that there's a lag effect. And a couple of years from now, when we look and we put 2020 and the recession there, you're going to see that the poverty rate jumps up there. Now, how long does it take for us to have it then have the downward spells afterwards? All right, our last part that we have in here, the Warren Court. There, you'll have a question on your EOC somewhere about the Warren Court. We went over the various civil rights cases, Bill Brown versus Board of Education, and the Heart of Atlanta Motel case. The Heart of Atlanta Motel case builds upon Brown versus Board, where Brown versus Board has to do with segregation in public places with the schools. The Heart of Atlanta Motel will use the Constitution's interstate commerce clause to make it where even some private things like hotels and restaurants were not allowed to segregate in here. It will uphold the Civil Rights Act of '64. Now, the other three cases that you need to know are Gideon, Escobedo, and Miranda there. All three of these cases have to do with the rights of the accused. Gideon, which is a case here in Florida, where you have a person that has not even a high school education that is arrested because of a lot of his prior arrests that he had. He's going to be sentenced to a large time in prison. Now, at that time in Florida, we went by the ruling, which was the Powell case before, which the only time that you were guaranteed an attorney from the state of Florida was if you had a capital punishment. You were going to be put to death. And Gideon is having to then go and be his own lawyer because he couldn't afford one against a lawyer that had all that time in college and passed the bar. Well, obviously didn't do too well in that case there. He will have what is called a pauper's papers. He will write to the Supreme Court. I believe the letter's in the Smithsonian that you can see this letter, and every few years there's one of these pauper paper cases that comes up. But he writes to the Supreme Court, and they review the case, and they will say that, and this is where the precedent that has started, is that you are guaranteed an attorney in the case of a felony. Later on, it was even expanded to misdemeanors in there if you can't afford one there. So you see that case. Escobedo's definitely not a nice guy, but for Escobedo, he is asking for his attorney when he's in the interrogation room, and the attorney, I believe, is in the hallway asking, and they won't let him. But what happens in Escobedo, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Warren, will say that if you are accused, you have the right to have a legal counsel or your attorney with you when you're being questioned. Miranda, who's also not a very nice guy, but when he is arrested, he will end up confessing a whole lot for the crime. There really isn't much evidence besides his confession there. If he would have used his Fifth Amendment rights and not said anything, then he would not have been able to be convicted. So this is where in the Miranda case, they say if you're accused of something, you must be told of what rights you have. There. Most of you are familiar with the Miranda warning. Hopefully not personally, but if you've seen it on TV. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney there. That's this part in there. You have the right to have an attorney present there. So all of those cases, again, these three cases combined together. Now, in government, we kind of look and see where the court swings towards people that are accused. Later on, more conservative courts with Rehnquist, that pendulum will swing back to people. So like for Gideon, you're guaranteed an attorney there, but there's Supreme Court cases that it doesn't guarantee you a good attorney or awake or sober one there. For Miranda, a lot of people think, If the police officer forgets to read me the Miranda rights, it can't be used against me. Well, the Supreme Court has ruled in certain instances, like you're in the back of a police cruiser and handcuffed, that yes, it still can be used, because you think of media now compared to the 1960s. We've had several generations growing up, and because of TV and movies, you know that you don't just get put in the back of the police car with being handcuffed unless they're thinking of something for you. So this is where the Supreme Court, and we kind of see the pendulum swinging in different ways that you have in here.